Part 1. My Kingdom of Cardboard and Forgotten Things. The world began and ended with the alley. Its set was a sour, complicated thing, a layer of stale beer from the crookedly stacked kegs, a sharp tang of grease from the diner's exhaust fan, and underneath it all, the damp, sweet rot of things forgotten. The fan was a constant, a low, metallic rumble that vibrated through the soles of Elara's worn-out sneakers. It was the alley's heart, and its beat was the only one she could rely on.
This is TS Simple Serene Stories. Before we get back to this touching story, I have a quick question for you. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments below. And if you believe that humanity and miracles are eternal, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Now, let's get back to the story.
Her nest was tucked into the narrow, defensible gap between two hulking green dumpsters and the grimy brick wall of the diner. It was a kingdom with a single wall, a fortress of solitude. The castle itself was a refrigerator box, its cardboard softened by damp but still holding its shape. From the outside, it was trash. From the inside, it was everything. The interior walls were papered with scavenged newspapers, their headlines and stories meaningless to her. She read only the pictures. A smiling woman holding a bright orange box of soap, a man in a suit laughing from behind the wheel of a gleaming car. A family gathered around a golden brown turkey. They were tapestries of a world she observed but did not belong to. On a low, overturned bucket, her throne, she would perform the morning survey of the royal court. Her treasures were not jewels and gold, but tools of survival, each given a name that lent it a weight beyond its humble form. On a cracked piece of plywood that served as the royal dais lay the merchant's coins, a neat stack of bottle caps, their colorful metal faces gleaming dully in the gloom. Beside them sat the eye that sees around corners. A triangular shard of a shattered car mirror. It was her most prized possession, a sliver of magic that allowed her to see the alley's entrance without exposing herself. And next to that, carefully centered, was the winter sun, a half-burnt nub of a white candle, its wick a blackened curl. She had not dared to light it yet. It was a treasure for a colder, more desperate day, a promise of light and warmth held in reserve. It had been 42 days since she'd become a ghost. 6 weeks since the last door had clicked shut behind her. The memories of that other life, the before, didn't come as stories. They came in flashes, sharp and unwelcome, like the shard of her mirror catching the sun. The echoing clang and shout of the group home's common room, a sound so loud it felt like it could break your bones. The feel of a caseworker's hand on her shoulder. Not cruel, not kind, just indifferent. A hand that moved her from one place to the next like a piece of furniture. It was the specific fear of waking up to find a new stranger in the bed across the room that had finally made her run. That fear was a loud, chaotic thing. The fear she felt now was different. It was a low, constant hum beneath the surface of everything, a quiet companion. She preferred it. This fear kept her sharp. It was the fear that taught her the art of urban camouflage, the rhythms of the city. She knew that from 8 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, she had to be invisible. That was the time of the hunters, the truancy officers and their city-issued cars and the beat cops who sometimes swept the alleys. Elara had memorized their routes, the times they were most likely to appear. During those hours, she was a statue, a shadow, a folded part of the scenery. Her kingdom wasn't a game, it wasn't a fantasy to escape into, it was a structure, an exercise in control. In a world where she controlled nothing, she was the absolute monarch of this 3-foot by 5-foot space. Here, she dictated the laws. The first law, be silent. The second law, be watchful. The third law, leave no trace. The city itself was a landscape of this same duality. A dropped half-eaten sandwich in the gutter was a royal banquet. The sudden piercing wail of a distant siren was not just a noise, it was a call to prayer, a command to flatten herself into the shadows and hold her breath until it passed. She found value in what the world threw away. She was a sparrow, after all. And sparrows knew how to find crumbs where others saw only dirt. At night, the city lights bled into the low-hanging clouds, staining the sky a permanent, artificial twilight that never truly became dark. This was when the alley's other residents, the rats, would emerge. They were fellow survivors, and she watched them with a wary respect. They were quick, silent, and knew every secret path. They scuttled through the darkness, their small bodies intent on the singular purpose of seeing the next sunrise. Elara understood. As she curled up inside her castle, pulling a filthy blanket over her shoulders. She would listen to their skittering movements and the steady rumble of the ventilation fan. In her kingdom of cardboard and forgotten things, she too was intent on only one thing: surviving to see the dawn. Part 2. The day I found a broken melody. Foraging was a hunt, and every hunt had rules. The first rule was to never hunt in your own territory. The diner alley was for shelter, not for food. It was too risky to mix the two. So, on the third day of a gnawing hunger that had moved from a dull ache to a sharp-toothed bite, Elara ventured out. She moved with the practiced invisibility of a stray cat, keeping to the shadows, her small frame a fleeting whisper against the city's roar. Her path took her 8 blocks east into a neighborhood where the trash was different. Here, the garbage bags were thick and black, and they smelled not of rot, but of perfume and paper and opportunity. It was next to a pristine can, nestled in a bag of old clothes that still held the ghost of a floral scent, that she found it. A small wooden box. It wasn't beautiful, not at first. It was grimy, its dark wood scuffed at the corners. On its lid, a small, jagged metal peg stood, where something else was meant to be. A spinning dancer, perhaps, now broken off and lost to the world. It was clearly trash, discarded and unwanted, but it was whole. It was a box. She took it. The box had a surprising weight in her small, cold hands. Back in the relative safety of a park alcove, she wiped the grime away with the hem of her oversized sweatshirt. Beneath the dirt, the wood had a deep, warm grain. On its side was a small, tarnished brass crank. She held her breath and turned it. Resistance, then a series of tiny metallic notes. Out into the gray air, hesitant and thin, like new ice forming on a puddle. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 notes of a lonely, incomplete melody, and then a sad, definitive. She cranked it again. The same 5 notes, the same abrupt. It was a question with no answer. A sentence that ended before it could say what it meant. The sound was a deliberate, structured beauty, a stark contrast to the random chaos of the city, the screech of tires, the shouts of strangers, the wail of sirens. This was different. This was on purpose. This was music. The box was no longer just a box. It was a puzzle. For the rest of the day, survival was secondary. The gnawing in her stomach was muffled by a new, more urgent need to fix the music, to hear the rest of the song. She found a bent paperclip near a storm drain and, with the intense focus of a bomb disposal expert, used its tip to poke at the tiny, intricate mechanism inside the box. She peered into the works, a miniature city of brass, teeth, and metal pins on a revolving drum. She could see the pins that pluck the notes, and she could see the blank space where more pins should have been. It wasn't just stuck, it was unfinished. Frustration mounted with each turn of the crank. The silence that followed each attempt was louder than the notes themselves. It was a hollow, ringing void where the rest of the melody should have been. It felt like a personal failure. It was one thing to be unable to conjure food from thin air or a roof from nothing. Those were the problems of the world, too big and formless to fight. But this was a small, contained thing. This was a machine. It should work. Her inability to mend this one tiny, broken piece of the world felt like a judgment on her own brokenness. She sat with her back against the cool brick, the grit of the alley floor pressing into her thin trousers. The surprising cold of the metal crank was a constant presence against her thumb. Dirt worked its way under her fingernails as she turned the box over and over, searching for a secret latch, a hidden clue, some way to open it up and force it to yield its secrets. There was none. As the artificial twilight of the city began to bleed across the sky, she gave up. She tucked the music box into the deep pocket of her coat, where it rested against her hip like a second, mechanical heart. The hunger had returned, sharper now, but it was accompanied by something else. The melody. The 5 broken notes played on a loop inside her head. Plink, plonk, plink, plink, plonk. She started to hum it under her breath, a quiet, tuneless sound. Her mind began to wander, to explore the silence that followed the thunk. What would the 6th note be? Would it go up or down? Was it a happy song, cut off before the chorus, or a sad song that had simply reached its mournful end? Lying in her cardboard castle that night, with the rumble of the diner fan for company, she hummed the 5 notes, over and over, adding a 6th of her own imagining, then a 7th. The song was hers to finish now. The broken melody was a seed, and in the barren soil of her loneliness, it had begun to take root. Part 3. I asked a stranger for help. Here's what happened. The music box remained silent. Its stubborn refusal to sing became a dull, heavy weight in Elara's pocket. The 5-note melody was a ghost that haunted her, a constant looping reminder of her own powerlessness. Her world, once defined by the clear, sharp edges of survival, was now clouded by this one small, impossible task. It was during this time that she began to notice the old man. He was a fixture on a particular bench in the park that bordered her territory, the one with the peeling green paint. Unlike the other street dwellers who seemed to dissolve into the landscape, he had a quiet sense of order about him. He was old, with a face like a crumpled map and hands dotted with the brown spots of age, but he was neat. His coat, though frayed at the cuffs, was clean. The small, wheeled cart beside him held not a jumble of possessions, but a carefully stacked collection of books, protected from the elements by a sheet of clear plastic. He was a landmark, a point of stability in her shifting, uncertain world. From the safe distance of a large oak tree, Elara became his student. She watched him share half of a meager sandwich with a woman whose hands trembled too much to hold her own. She saw him patiently coax a pigeon with a broken wing into a shoebox. His movements slow and deliberate, his voice a low, calming murmur. One afternoon, she watched him perform a miracle. A pigeon, one of the city's dirt-gray flock, had a piece of string tangled tightly around its leg. The man spent nearly an hour, armed with nothing but patience and a pair of nail clippers he produced from his pocket, carefully snipping the bird free. He didn't rush. He didn't grab. He simply waited, his gentleness a strange, magnetic force. He represented an order and a kindness she craved with an intensity that surprised her. The desperation over the music box finally crested. After another morning of fruitless poking with her paperclip, a cold knot of failure tightened in her stomach. It felt worse than hunger. He was there, on his bench, performing surgery on a book with a broken spine. He had a small pot of glue and a strip of cloth, and his liver-spotted hands, which should have been clumsy with age, were steady and precise. This was it. The moment was a razor's edge. Every instinct screamed at her to stay hidden, to remain invisible. The first rule of survival was to never, ever draw attention. To ask for help was to admit you were helpless, and helplessness was a scent that attracted predators. But the silence of the music box was a louder, more terrifying threat. Her feet moved before her mind could protest. The walk across the patchy grass felt like crossing a vast, empty desert. Each step was a cannon blast in the quiet of the afternoon. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She could feel the damp chill of the air on her cheeks, see the way the man's coat, smelling faintly of old paper and recent rain, rose and fell with his breathing. She stopped in front of him. He didn't look up at first. His attention focused on smoothing the cloth over the book's spine. She stood there, a small, silent statue of terror, the dead weight of the music box clutched in her hand. Finally, he sensed her. He raised his head, his eyes, pale blue and webbed with wrinkles, blinking slowly. They held no alarm, no annoyance, only a mild, weary curiosity. Words failed her. Her throat was a knot of dry dust. All she could do was extend her hand, her small fist uncurling to reveal the small wooden box. It lay on her palm like a sacrificed heart. Her hand trembled so violently, she was afraid she would drop it. The man's gaze shifted from her face to the box. He put his glue pot down with the same deliberate care he gave everything, and held out his own hand. She didn't place the box in his palm. She couldn't. He had to take it from her. His fingers, cool and dry, brushed against hers as he lifted it. The brief touch was like an electric shock. He examined the box with a professional seriousness, turning it over, inspecting the broken peg, the silent crank. He wasn't dismissing it as a child's broken toy. He was giving her problem the full weight of his attention. A gut-wrenching feeling of vulnerability washed over Elara. She was exposed, her one small hope held in the hands of a stranger. He tried the crank. Thunk. He nodded to himself, a silent confirmation of its brokenness. Thoughtful. The mainspring for the comb is shot, he said, his voice raspy but gentle. Or the governor is jammed, needs a jeweler's screwdriver to get the housing off. Something I don't have, little one. Apologetic. I'm sorry. It was the answer she expected. Disappointment, sharp and cold, pierced through her. She nodded, her gaze falling to the ground, ready to retreat back into her invisible world, hesitant. But, he said, and she looked up. He was still holding the box, looking at it with a thoughtful frown. Thoughtful. Tell me something. He leaned forward slightly, his pale eyes meeting hers. He didn't ask her name, where she came from, or if she was hungry. He asked the one question that mattered, curious. What does it sound like when it sings? The question was a key, unlocking something deep inside her. He was the first person to ask about its life, not its death. To see the song, not just the silence. He saw the essence of the thing. A strange, unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest, a slow-blooming flower in the frozen landscape of her fear. It was the first warmth she had felt in 42 days that didn't come from the sun. Part 4. We built a library on the sidewalk. The question hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge, echoing. What does it sound like when it sings? Elara couldn't answer, not with words, but a silent understanding passed between them. Silas couldn't fix the broken music, but he had acknowledged the song. That was enough. A new ritual began. Silas didn't intrude on her kingdom, but he would leave small offerings at the edge of the alley, like a respectful visitor leaving gifts at the border of a foreign land. The offerings were always books. The first was a thin paperback with a glossy, slick cover, its illustration of a wide-eyed bear missing a button still vibrant. Elara took it back to her nest, her fingers tracing the outline of the bear, her imagination filling the silent pages with a story of her own. A few days later, he was on his bench when she passed, the book with the bear tucked safely in her coat. He didn't ask for it back. Instead, he gestured to the empty space beside him, observing. The wind is sharp today, he said to the air, inviting. It's warmer on this bench. It took her a full minute to move, her feet rooted to the pavement by a mixture of fear and a strange magnetic pull. She perched on the very edge of the bench, a sparrow ready to take flight at the slightest provocation. Silas didn't speak to her directly. He simply opened a book he held in his lap, its pages soft and yellowed with age, and began to read. His voice was a low, steady murmur, a stark contrast to the city's sharp, chaotic sounds. It was an anchor in the storm. He read a story about a rabbit made of velveteen who longed to be real. Elara listened, captivated. The words painted pictures in her mind, more vivid than any she had seen in the newspapers. It was a kind of magic she had never known, the magic of a story told just for you. The experience was transformative. For the first time, in a long time, the gnawing hum of fear in her belly went quiet, soothed by the rhythm of his voice. The idea, when it came, was not a sudden flash of lightning, but a slow, dawning light. It started with Silas's own small collection, the dozen or so books he kept in his cart shielded from the rain. A book is no good if it isn't read, he said one afternoon, looking at his small hoard. It's like a seed that's never planted. So they became gardeners. They started gathering more books from the recycling bins behind the library and in the wealthy neighborhoods where people threw away stories as easily as they threw away food. Each find was a treasure. They would bring them back to the alley, where Elara, with a damp cloth she kept for the purpose, would carefully wipe the grime from their covers. They smoothed bent pages and taped torn ones. They chose their location with strategic care, a patch of sidewalk at the mouth of the alley that caught the morning sun. On a large, flattened cardboard box, they arranged their collection. It wasn't just a pile of books. It was curated. Elara grouped them by size and by the feel of their covers, The matte ones together, the cloth-bound ones in a separate row. Silas called it the corner collection. It didn't take long for it to draw notice. Their first patron was a man Elara knew only as Sal, a cynical, one-legged veteran who usually sat against the wall across the street, his face a mask of weary anger. He hobbled over on his crutches, his gaze suspicious. "What's this, then?" he grumbled. "Some kind of charity stunt?" "It's a library," Elara said, her voice small but firm. Sal scoffed, but his eyes scanned the titles. He picked up a thick, dog-eared Western, flipping through it with a calloused thumb. He grunted, tucked it under his arm, and hobbled back to his spot without another word. The next day, the book was back in its place, and Sal had appointed himself the library's unofficial security, his glower fixed on anyone who lingered too long without showing proper respect for the books. Then came Maria, a young woman with tired eyes who pushed a stroller holding a wide-eyed baby. She would stop and borrow a picture book, sitting on the curb and pointing out the colorful images to her child, her voice a soft whisper. She always returned them, her face holding a quiet, fragile gratitude. Slowly, cautiously, a community began to form around the discarded stories. The air around the alley, once thick only with loneliness and survival, now held the rustle of turning pages and the murmur of shared words. Elara was no longer just a survivor, she was a librarian. The role came with a fierce, protective pride. One afternoon, a man returned a book with a page carelessly torn. A hot, possessive anger surged through her. This was her collection, her work. Silas saw the fury in her eyes. He put a gentle hand on her shoulder. "A torn page means it was loved, Elara," he said. "It means someone held it so tightly, they forgot their own strength. Its purpose isn't to be perfect. Its purpose is to be read." The anger receded, replaced by a dawning understanding. She was learning about community, about the messy, imperfect act of sharing. The books weren't treasures to be hoarded in her castle. They were seeds. And here on the corner in the full view of the world, they were finally beginning to grow. Part 5. They called us a nuisance. I called us a community. The corner collection flourished in the thin city sunlight. Its quiet success, however, began to cast a shadow. The shadow emanated from the front door of the Morning Grind, the cafe that shared the alley wall. Its owner was a man named Henderson, whose face seemed permanently clenched, like a fist. Elara had seen him through the cafe window, his shoulders hunched over columns of receipts, his voice a low, angry buzz on the phone. One afternoon, she saw him arguing with a delivery driver over an invoice, his face pale with a desperation that looked a lot like fear. His cafe, with its trendy chalkboard menu and wilting fern, was failing. And in his frightened eyes, the small community gathering at the mouth of his alley was not a library, it was an infestation. It was the final straw. The first attack was a quiet one. A piece of paper, folded neatly and tucked under a rock, on top of a stack of books. It was a note, written in the cafe's branded green ink on the back of a guest check. "Please remove this. It is bad for business." Silas read it and the sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. Sal saw it and spits on the ground, a string of curses following. Elara felt a cold knot form in her stomach. It was the polite, impersonal cruelty of the words that chilled her most. They didn't see the books, or Maria's baby smiling at the pictures, or the way Silas's voice could smooth the ragged edges of the day. They just saw something that was bitterly bad for business. They did not remove it. The library was as much a part of the corner now as the lamppost and the cracked pavement. A week later, the shadow grew longer. It arrived in the form of a man in a navy blue windbreaker, with the city crest embroidered on the chest. He had a weary face and a clipboard, and he walked with the tired resignation of someone who delivered bad news for a living. Mr. Henderson stood behind him, arms crossed, refusing to meet anyone's eye. "Folks, I've had a complaint," the city official said, his voice flat. He wasn't a villain. He was a bureaucrat, a cog in a machine that had no room for sidewalk libraries. "Obstruction of a public right-of-way, creating a public nuisance. You've got to clear this out." Sal, leaning heavily on his crutches, immediately bristled. "Nuisance? We're reading books." "This here is the most peaceful corner in this whole damn city." "Sir, I'm just telling you the ordinance," the man said, pulling a folded paper from his clipboard. "This is a formal warning. You have 7 days to comply. After that, sanitation will clear the area." He handed the paper to Silas. It was an official city notice. Its text a forest of dense, impersonal language, full of codes and statutes. The words felt alien, a language from another world that had come to declare war on theirs. The scent of stale coffee and disinfectant seemed to drift from the cafe, a sterile smell that was the opposite of the musty, living scent of their books. Sal kept arguing, his jaw set in a line of stubborn fury, but the official just kept repeating the same tired phrases. "Resigned. My hands are tied and tired. I'm just doing my job." It was then that Elara moved. She had been standing behind Silas, a silent observer, feeling the familiar instinct to shrink, to disappear. But as she looked at the neat stacks of books, their library, a different feeling pushed through the fear. It was a hot, righteous anger. How could stories be a nuisance? She stepped forward, out from behind the shield of Silas's frame. In her hands, she clutched a tattered copy of Corduroy, the book about the little bear in green overalls searching for a home. Its weight felt solid, real, a tangible piece of the world she was now fighting for. She held it up, not to the angry cafe owner or to the defiant Sal, but to the city official with the tired eyes. Her voice, when it came, was not a shout. It was as small and clear as a single drop of rain. Thoughtful. "Have you ever read this one?" she asked, her gaze steady. "It's about finding a home." The question hung in the air. The official stopped speaking. Sal's angry tirade trailed off. For a single, breathless moment, the city's noise seemed to fade. The man looked from the book to the small, serious girl holding it, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than weary duty crossed his face. He didn't have an answer. In the face of her simple, devastating question, the ordinances and the clipboards and the complaints suddenly seemed ridiculous. They were not a nuisance. They were a community, and Elara, the quiet sparrow, had just become its voice. Part 6. The Longest Night, when the Bulldozers came. The 7 days passed in a state of suspended animation. A fragile, unspoken hope had settled over their small community. Perhaps the official with the tired eyes had forgotten. Perhaps Elara's question about the book had worked some small, unseen magic. Sal kept his watch, a little more defiantly than before. Silas continued to read aloud each afternoon, his voice, a steady denial of the printed warning, tucked away in his coat. Elara found herself listening for the rumble of trucks, but each day ended in quiet, deepening the illusion that they had been spared. The illusion shattered on the 8th morning. The sound came first. It wasn't the familiar roar of a passing garbage truck, but something deeper, more guttural, a grinding, mechanical growl that vibrated up from the pavement, through the layers of her cardboard castle and into her bones. Elara's eyes snapped open in the pre-dawn gloom. She was instantly awake, every nerve alight with a primal dread. She peered through a small, tear-shaped hole in her box. The alley was flooded with an unnatural, flashing yellow light. 2 enormous white sanitation trucks blocked the entrance like beasts at the mouth of a cave. A smaller vehicle, a skid-steer loader with a frighteningly large bucket, idled beside them, its engine a menacing purr. The acrid smell of diesel exhaust burned the back of her throat. It wasn't a malicious raid, it was worse. It was impersonal, scheduled, efficient. Men in bright orange vests moved with a practiced indifference, their faces impassive in the strobing light. This was not about them. They were simply a job to be done, an obstruction to be cleared. Her first thought was of the library. She watched in frozen horror as 2 men began tossing the books. There was no anger in their movements, just a swift, thoughtless competence. Books on baking and gardening, adventure stories, and worn-out poetry collections. They all flew through the air, their pages fluttering like the wings of wounded birds, before disappearing into the dark, gaping maw of the truck. A high-pitched hydraulic whine sliced through the air, followed by a sickening final crunch as the compactor did its work. The stories were gone. Silas was there, pleading with one of the workers, his voice lost in the din. He tried to grab a stack of books, but a man in a uniform, a police officer, his presence making the scene feel even more sterile and absolute, put a firm hand on his shoulder and guided him back. Silas managed to drag a single bulging tote bag out of the way before his cart, with its remaining treasures, was hoisted up and emptied. Then they came for her kingdom. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. The men were heading for the dumpsters. They were heading for her nest. The officer who had stopped Silas began walking toward her hiding place, his heavy boots making dull, deliberate thuds on the pavement. His eyes scanned the area, and for a heart-stopping second, they seemed to lock onto the crack in her box. The specific fear she had been running from for 6 weeks erupted. This was it. This was how it ended. They would find her. They would take her. The officer's impassive face would be the last thing she saw before being sent back to the system, back to the noise and the hands that were neither cruel nor kind, but simply there. Back to a world where she was a file, a number, a problem to be managed. The instinct to survive, the one that had guided the sparrow for so long, took over. She didn't think, she moved. She scrambled out of the back of her box, a tiny shadow detaching from the larger ones. She stayed low, her body almost scraping the grimy ground, and scurried behind the relative cover of the kegs. The officer took another step toward her now empty box. He kicked it. It skidded across the pavement with a hollow, scraping sound. Empty. Elara didn't wait to see more. She fled. She ran out of the far end of the alley, her breath coming in ragged, silent sobs, the flashing yellow lights painting terrifying patterns on the walls around her. She didn't stop until the sounds and the diesel fumes were replaced by the distant hum of morning traffic. She found a space beneath a bridge where the darkness felt deep and absolute, and huddled there, her body uncontrollably. An hour later, Silas found her. He had the single tote bag of books with him. He said nothing, just sat beside her on the cold concrete. They watched the sunrise, casting long, mournful shadows. The alley, when they finally dared to return, was horrifyingly clean. Her box was gone. The dumpsters were back in their neat, orderly line. The ground where the library had stood was wet and dark from being hosed down. There was no sign that they had ever been there. It was as if their entire world had been a dream and the city had finally, violently woken up. Elara felt a cold emptiness she had never known, a silence deeper than any she had ever sought. The sparrow inside her was still. Its wings were broken, its song was gone. She huddled beside Silas, two survivors of a war no one else knew had been fought, staring at the clean, bare pavement where a kingdom had once stood. Part 7. All I had left was a crayon and a piece of the wall. Their new home was a hollow space under an overpass, a concrete womb that smelled of damp earth and diesel fumes. The roar of traffic overhead was a constant, thunderous sky, a sound so loud it vibrated deep in Elara's chest, shaking her loose from the world. For a full day, and then another, she was numb, a ghost in her own skin. The world had shrunk to this small patch of cold ground. Silas had the tote bag, the last surviving remnant of their library, but the books remained untouched. Their stories were silent, their magic gone. Elara would sit with her back against the cold concrete, her knees drawn up to her chin, and watch the traffic lights cycle from green to yellow to red in the distance. She didn't eat the food Silas managed to find. Hunger was a distant, unimportant ache. The vibrant, watchful sparrow inside her was gone, replaced by a heavy, gray stillness. On the third day, while Silas was gone, her gaze fell upon the remnants of an old fire in the center of their gloomy space, a circle of blackened stones and ash. Lying amongst the debris was a single, unburnt piece of charcoal, long and slender like a finger. She picked it up. It was light, almost weightless, and left a faint black smudge on her palm. It was something to hold. For hours, she just held it, the gritty, waxy texture, a small, solid fact in a world that had dissolved into nothing. The roar of the trucks overhead was the sound of the world being erased over and over. They had erased her kingdom. They had erased the library. They had erased the sound of Silas's voice, reading about a velveteen rabbit. Then her hand moved. It was not a decision, it was an instinct, an involuntary twitch, like a nerve waking up after being asleep for too long. She shifted, turning to face the wide, curved wall of the underpass. The concrete was stained and gray, but one section was relatively smooth. Her hand rose, the piece of charcoal held tight in her fist. The first sound was a hesitant scrape. The first line was black and stark against the gray wall. It wasn't a hopeful line. It was an angry, definitive one. It was the outline of a refrigerator box. She drew the tear-shaped peephole she had made, the one that had served as the eye of her castle. The drawing that followed was not a fantasy. It was an archive. It was a map of a world that no longer existed. And she drew it with the obsessive precision of a cartographer. This was not an act of hope. It was an act of testimony. A desperate attempt to prove that it had all been real. She drew the overturned bucket, her throne. She drew the two hulking dumpsters that had been her castle walls. She drew the diner and its rumbling ventilation fan. Her hand moved faster now. The scraping sound a steady rhythm against the thunder of the traffic. Scrape, scrape, scrape. She drew the sidewalk and on it, the neat rectangle of the corner collection. She drew a stick figure with a beard and a book in his hands. Silas. She drew another with one leg and two crutches. Sal. Standing guard. As she drew, something began to shift inside her. The numb, gray stillness was being pushed back by a focused intensity. The muscle memory of creation was an antidote to the poison of destruction. She was not just grieving her loss anymore, she was defining it. She was giving it form. She drew the music box, a small, careful square in its imaginary crate. She paused. Her hand hovered over the drawing for a long moment. Then, with a lighter touch, she added 5 faint, wavering lines spiraling out from it, the ghost of its broken melody. In that moment, the sparrow inside her stirred. It wasn't a thought, not a string of words, but a profound, bone-deep feeling. The men in their trucks had taken the cardboard. They had taken the books and the bottle caps and the mirror. They had taken the things, but they couldn't take this. They couldn't take the memory. The kingdom hadn't been the box. It had been the idea of the kingdom. The library hadn't been the paper. It had been the stories. These were things she carried inside her. They lived in her head, and now, they lived here, on this wall. Her power was not in a place. It was in her hand. When Silas returned, he found her standing before the wall, her small body covered in a fine layer of black dust. The mural was complete. It was a stark, black and gray monument. A child's testimony scrawled on the underbelly of the city. It was an accusation. It was a eulogy. It was a declaration. It said, firmly, "We were here." Elara's hand was still pressed to the wall, the piece of charcoal worn down to a tiny stub. The scrape, scrape, scrape had stopped, but in the roaring silence under the bridge, she could still hear it. It was the sound of a new song beginning. Part 8. I walked into the one place I wasn't allowed. The drawing on the wall under the bridge became their secret history, a monument no one else would ever see. Days bled into one another, each a cycle of scavenging and returning to the hollow roar of their concrete cave. One afternoon, their search for food took them back to the edge of their old territory. The alley looked naked, sterile. In front of the Morning Grind Cafe, a white van with a television station logo was parked at the curb. A small crew was set up on the sidewalk. A man with headphones held a long pole with a fuzzy microphone at its end. A cameraman peered through his lens. In the center of it all, bathed in the unnatural brightness of a portable camera light, stood a reporter with a polished smile and Mr. Henderson. Elara and Silas watched from the shadows of a doorway across the street. The reporter was nodding, her voice artificially warm and bright as she spoke to the camera. A successful urban renewal initiative, she was saying, that has made this neighborhood cleaner and safer for business owners and residents alike. She turned to Mr. Henderson. Sir, you were having some problems with vagrancy before the city cleanup. How have things changed? Mr. Henderson, basking in the light, straightened his apron. It's like night and day, he said, his voice full of a self-righteous relief that made Elara's stomach clench. It's a safer environment. My customers feel more comfortable. The city did a wonderful job. The lie was so clean, so confident. It was the official story, the one written by the winners. It erased the musty smell of books, the sound of Silas's reading voice, the defiant stance of Sal on his crutches. It erased their entire world and called the resulting emptiness progress. A feeling Elara had never known before surged through her. It wasn't the hot, righteous anger she'd felt when they received the warning. It was a cold, pure fury. The drawing on the wall under the bridge was not enough. Their history was a secret, but this lie was being broadcast to the whole world. She looked around, her eyes darting. In a pile of refuse by a lamppost sat a large, flattened cardboard box. Its surface relatively clean. It was a blank slate. It was a canvas. Before Silas could ask what she was doing, she ran to it. She tore off the largest, smoothest panel. She dug in her pocket for the small, worn nub of charcoal she now carried with her everywhere. It was her only tool. With a frantic, desperate energy, she began to draw. This was not the slow, methodical archival she had performed under the bridge. This was a frantic act of testimony. Her hand flew across the cardboard, recreating the mural from memory, the refrigerator box, the library, Silas reading, the music box with its ghostly notes. The lines were jagged, fueled by a ferocious need to make the truth visible. Silas watched her, his face a mixture of alarm and awe. Elara? He began, but she didn't hear him. She was no longer a 9-year-old girl. She was a witness. She was a warrior, and this drawing was her weapon. When it was done, she held it up. It was a crude, stark echo of her secret mural, a portable piece of their lost world. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out from the shadows of the doorway and began to walk. The street felt miles wide. Each step was a deliberate choice, pulling her out of the safety of invisibility and into the blinding light of the television crew. This wasn't bravery, not the kind she'd read about in Silas's books. It was a desperate, last-ditch act, the culmination of every bit of fight she had left. She wasn't thinking about what would happen next, about the police or the hunters or the system she had run from. She was thinking only of the lie. She was driven by the singular, overwhelming need for the truth to be seen. She walked into the one place she wasn't allowed, their story. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She simply walked to the edge of the camera's frame, right beside a stunned Mr. Henderson, and stopped. She raised the cardboard drawing, holding it with both hands so it wouldn't tremble. She held it up for the camera, for the world, to see. The effect was instantaneous. The reporter's bright professional smile faltered, her words catching in her throat. The cameraman instinctively widened his shot to include the strange, silent interruption. Mr. Henderson's face, which had been full of relieved satisfaction, went pale with a momentary flash of panic as he recognized the small, soot-stained girl. An absolute silence fell, the kind of silence that feels louder than noise. The artificial warmth of the reporter's voice vanished. The hum of the city seemed to recede. For a single, charged second, everyone, the crew, the reporter, the handful of passers-by who had stopped to watch, looked from the well-dressed man talking about progress to the silent, fierce girl and her stark, powerful drawing. The official narrative had just collided with the real one. Part 9. They didn't see a homeless girl. They saw her story. The silence that followed Elara's arrival was a vacuum, pulling all the air and noise from the street. Mr. Henderson looked as if he'd swallowed a wasp. The cameraman, acting on pure instinct, tightened the focus, letting the small girl with the large drawing fill the frame. The reporter's name was Maya. She was young, ambitious, and deeply, profoundly tired of stories about new coffee blends and successful urban renewal initiatives. She was tired of puff pieces. In her line of work, she had become an expert in curated reality, and she knew, with a certainty that made the hairs on her arms stand up, that she was staring at the raw, uncurated truth. This was not a disruption of her story. This was the story. Her training took over, but it was guided by a sudden, fierce compassion. She signaled the cameraman to hold the shot. Then, she did something that shifted the power dynamic of the entire scene. She knelt. She brought herself down to Elara's level, the rough pavement pressing into the knee of her expensive trousers. The fuzzy foam of the large microphone, which had been pointed at Mr. Henderson's self-satisfied face moments before, was now held gently in front of Elara. Maya's face, stripped of its bright, television-ready smile, was full of a focused, intelligent curiosity. She didn't ask the questions Elara had been conditioned to fear. What's your name? Where are your parents? Are you hungry? Those were the questions of the system, the questions that turned a person into a case file. Instead, she looked at the drawing, her gaze respectful. "Can you tell me about your drawing?" she asked, her voice soft, inviting. Elara's eyes were fixed on the cardboard in her hands. The sharp edge of it dug into her fingers, a small, grounding pain that kept her anchored to the moment. This was territory she knew. She wasn't being asked to explain her life. She was being asked to present her work. She found her voice. It wasn't the whisper of the alley or the trembling plea for help she'd offered Silas. It was the voice she had used to defend the library, only now it was stripped of all emotion. It was flat, documentary, the voice of a historian reciting facts. She pointed a small, smudged finger at the charcoal lines. "This was the library," she said, her finger tracing the rectangle of the corner collection. Silas read here. Her finger moved to the stick figure with the book. Sal stood here. A tap on the figure with the crutches. Maria and her baby sat here. Her finger then moved to the center of the drawing, to the heart of her lost world. This was my box. She traced the outline of her castle. The music box was on this crate. Her finger rested on the small square with the ghostly, spiraling notes. She said nothing more. She didn't need to. She didn't say they took it from us. She didn't say we're homeless. She didn't say I'm scared. The drawing said all of that. By simply explaining her art, she was telling her entire story without ever having to become a victim. She was not a beggar asking for pity. She was the artist. She was the archivist, and her voice, small and steady, reclaimed her own narrative. Maya held the silence for a long moment, letting the weight of the simple testimony settle. She looked from the drawing to Elara's fierce, serious face. She saw the story. Not the easy, prepackaged story of a homeless girl, a problem to be solved with a donation and a headline. She saw the much more complex and powerful story of a community built from nothing, of knowledge shared on a sidewalk, of a home made from cardboard, of art born from ashes. The story that aired on the 6 o'clock news was not the one about the successful city cleanup. The segment began with a close-up of a child's drawing, stark and raw on a piece of cardboard. The city's indifference, so often shielded by abstract numbers and bureaucratic language, was suddenly punctured by a specific, undeniable human story. People didn't respond to the overwhelming problem of homelessness. They responded to a drawing of a lost kingdom. In that moment, under the harsh glare of the camera light, Elara was not invisible. She was not a nuisance. They didn't see a homeless girl. They saw her story. And it was a story that could not be ignored. Part 10. This isn't a fairy tale ending. It's a beginning. The story of the girl with the charcoal drawing did not solve homelessness. It didn't close Mr. Henderson's cafe or magically erect a new library on the corner. A fairy tale ending did not arrive with the evening news. Instead, something far more complicated and real descended. Attention. The news segment generated a small, local stir. It brought donations to the station, mostly small checks and bags of canned goods. But it also brought the system. A well-meaning but overwhelmed social worker with a tired face and a thick binder found Elara and Silas under the bridge. The sight of her official ID badge sent a jolt of pure ice through Elara's veins. The woman's words were kind, but they were the words of the system she had fled, full of talk about placements, intake forms, and protocols. The immediate plan was to place Elara back into an emergency shelter for children, the very gateway to the world of echoing common rooms and indifferent hands that she had run from. But the story had also given them an advocate. Maya, the reporter, hadn't forgotten them after the cameras were turned off. When she learned of the city's plan, she intervened, making calls and arguing that sending Elara back into the exact environment that had failed her was not a solution. She used the momentum from her story to find another way. The way was a small, underfunded youth outreach center in a converted warehouse on the other side of town. It had a dedicated arts program run by a woman who had been moved to tears by the image of Elara's drawing. Through the center's network, a new, fragile arrangement was made. Silas was given a bed in a small, clean shelter for seniors, and Elara was placed in a nearby group home, not a state-run institution, but a smaller, quieter house. Safety, Elara discovered, had sharp edges. The group home was warm and the bed was soft, but the silence was unnerving. There was no rumble of a ventilation fan, no thunder of traffic overhead. The other children were loud and moved with a casual confidence that was utterly foreign to her. At night, she would lie awake, listening to the unfamiliar creaks of the house, her body rigid with a tension that never eased. She began hoarding food, a bread roll from dinner, an apple from the communal fruit bowl, stashing it in a shoebox under her bed. The sparrow's instinct to prepare for famine was too deeply ingrained to be soothed by a full pantry. Her only sanctuary was the arts program at the youth center. The room was a chaotic, colorful mess that smelled gloriously of paint, clay, and turpentine. It was loud, but it was the noise of creation, not anxiety. For the first week, Elara wouldn't participate. She would sit in a corner, a silent observer, clutching the broken music box in her pocket. The art teacher, a woman named Lena, with paint-splattered hands and kind, patient eyes, didn't push. She never tried to coax Elara into joining the group. She simply left a blank sketchbook and a stick of charcoal on the small table in Elara's corner each afternoon. For days, they remained untouched. Then, one afternoon, Elara picked up the charcoal. Weeks passed. The city grew colder as it trudged toward winter. Elara slowly, tentatively, began to exist in her new world. She learned the names of the other children. She stopped hiding food. She learned that the art room was a place where you didn't have to talk. You could let the colors and shapes talk for you. The arts program held a small presentation for the kids to show their parents or caseworkers what they had been working on. It was an informal affair in the main room, with paper cups of juice and a plate of cookies. When her turn came, Elara felt the old, familiar terror rise, a cold tide threatening to pull her under. But she looked at Silas, who was sitting in the front row, his face glowing with a quiet pride, and at Maya and Lena standing by the wall, and she found her feet. She walked to the front of the room. She wasn't holding a large drawing. Her sketchbook remained closed on the chair. Instead, with both hands, she held up the small wooden music box. "This was broken," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it carried through the quiet room. She had used the soft, gray clay from the art room to sculpt a new ballerina for the top. The figure was clumsy, its limbs a little too thick, its pose slightly lopsided. It was imperfect and obviously handmade. It was hers. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of sheet music paper. She carefully unfolded it. On the staff, she had not drawn real notes, but a series of her own charcoal marks, a visual representation of a melody only she could hear. They spiraled up the page, confident and complete. She held it up beside the music box. "This is the rest of the song," she whispered. The room was utterly still. No one knew what to say. Then from the back, one of the other kids, a boy who had once teased her for being too quiet, began to clap. It was a slow, soft, rhythmic sound. A smile didn't come to Elara's face. She hadn't learned how to do that yet. But for the first time in months, maybe years, the tight, knotted muscles across her shoulders finally, completely released. Hope had not been a fairy tale ending. It hadn't been a magic door she had stumbled through. It had been the quiet, stubborn, terrifying work of building a new door, piece by broken piece. And now, with the tools of clay and charcoal in her hands, and the sound of a fragile, new community at her back, she was finally taking her first step through it.
Thank you for taking a quiet moment with us. Every story is a journey, and we're so glad you joined us for this one.
We believe stories are a way to connect, even when we're apart. If you felt a connection to this tale, we invite you to subscribe and become part of our growing circle.
Our question for you today is, what's a simple moment of peace you've experienced this week?
Share it in the comments. Let's fill this space with serene moments.
Until the next story, be well.